We've all heard the phrase get big or get out. It's been the mantra of modern agriculture for decades. The idea is simple. Bigger farms are safer. They have more land, more machines, more output. In theory, that size should equal strength. But what if I told you that in reality, many large farms are struggling just as much, sometimes even more, than the small ones? They don't collapse overnight in some dramatic fashion. Instead, they collapse quietly, worn down by pressure, debt, and a system that rewards constant growth while punishing stability. This is the great paradox of modern farming. To really understand it, we need to stop looking at farming as just a production system and start seeing it for what it truly is, an economic system. For generations, the logic in farming has been straightforward. If your profit margins are thin, the solution is to scale up. Produce more by bigger equipment, expand your acreage. And on paper, this makes perfect sense. Larger farms can negotiate better prices for their supplies and their crops. They can spread their costs, like insurance or a manager's salary, over more land, making each acre cheaper to run. They can also access financing and loans more easily than a smaller operation. So, pursuing growth feels not just logical, but responsible. It feels like the smart thing to do. But here is the catch. What looks like safety is often just exposure on a massive scale. And that's where the trouble begins. Growth is never free. It always comes with a price tag. To scale up, farms have to take on huge commitments. We're talking about massive loans for state-of-the-art equipment that can cost hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars. They sign long-term leases for land, locking themselves into payments for years to come. They invest in infrastructure like new barns, grain bins, and irrigation systems. On top of that, their fuel and labor expenses balloon. Suddenly, every single expansion locks the farm into higher fixed costs. And fixed costs are relentless. They don't care if you have a drought, if commodity prices crash, or if global markets go haywire. They demand payment on schedule, no matter what. At this point, size stops being about flexibility and starts becoming a heavy obligation. The farm is no longer nimble, it's a giant, and giants can't pivot quickly. Let's talk about the machines. Modern agriculture runs on some of the most advanced technology on the planet. Large farms depend on enormous combines, high-clearance sprayers, GPS-guided tractors, and highly specialized harvesters. These machines are incredibly powerful and efficient. They allow a handful of people to manage thousands of acres, but they are also economically fragile. First, they depreciate incredibly fast. A brand new combine can lose a huge chunk of its value the second it leaves the dealership lot. Second, they require constant and expensive maintenance to keep running. And third, they are pretty much useless outside of very narrow windows of use. A combine might only run for a few weeks a year during harvest. The rest of the time, it's just a very expensive piece of metal sitting in a shed. When your entire farm's capacity is defined by these machines, any downtime becomes a serious danger. A breakdown during harvest can be a disaster. And when it's time to replace one, that usually means taking on another mountain of debt. The very tools meant to create efficiency become liabilities. You might think that with more land, risk gets diluted, but that's not how it works. On a large farm, scale doesn't soften risk, it magnifies it. Think about it this way, a small, 10% loss on a small farm is a setback. It hurts, but it's probably survivable. That same 10% loss on a massive, multi-million-dollar operation can be absolutely catastrophic. A few cents drop in the price of corn, a spike in the cost of fertilizer, a sudden surge in fuel prices. These are the shocks that ripple through the system. Scale doesn't act as a buffer against this volatility. It amplifies it. This is why large farms can be incredibly efficient at producing food, but at the same time, incredibly fragile. They're built for the best-case scenario, not the inevitable bumps in the road. As farms get bigger, they become less local and more plugged into global systems. This creates a whole new layer of vulnerability. They depend on global supply chains for fertilizer, which can be disrupted by conflicts thousands of miles away. They are at the mercy of international fuel markets, where prices can swing wildly based on geopolitical events. Their income often relies on export pricing and contracts with distant, multinational processors. This disconnect means that when global systems wobble, large farms feel it first and hardest. A shipping crisis in the Suez Canal, a policy change in China, a drought in Brazil, all of these can have a direct and immediate impact on a farm in the American Midwest. These large operations are optimized for a stable, predictable world. But we don't live in that world anymore. Disruption is the new normal, and these farms weren't designed for it. At a certain scale, the very nature of farming changes. The person running the farm shifts from being a farmer to being a manager. The land itself is no longer just soil and ecosystems. It becomes a column on a spreadsheet. Decisions are no longer driven primarily by what's best for the land or long-term resilience. Instead, they're driven by cash flow projections, loan covenants dictated by the bank, and insurance requirements. It's no longer about soil health. It's about hitting yield targets to make the next loan payment. It's not about building a resilient system. It's about maximizing output in the current quarter. Farming becomes a game of logistics, finance, and risk management. And in this game, even as the farm produces an enormous volume of food, the profit margins get squeezed thinner and thinner. This is how a farm can be massively productive and still struggle to stay financially afloat. This brings us to the debt growth trap. For many large farms, growth isn't about improving the business, it's about servicing the debt they already have. It's a cycle. You take on debt to expand. Then you need to expand again to generate enough cash flow to cover the payments on that debt. More land is needed to cover the payments, which means more yield is needed to cover the costs, which means more debt is needed to buy the equipment to farm that land. Eventually, the farm stops growing by choice. It grows by necessity. At that point, survival no longer depends on the farmer's skill or the farm's internal strength. It depends entirely on external conditions staying favorable: good weather, stable prices, low interest rates. The farm has become too big to fail, but also too fragile to survive a real storm. But it's not all doom and gloom. Some large farms do survive and even thrive, but they look different. They don't follow the standard get big or get out model. They consciously control their input costs, finding ways to use less fertilizer, less fuel. They obsessively reduce their debt exposure, often buying used equipment or choosing not to expand. They diversify their income streams, so they're not reliant on a single crop or market. Crucially, they design their systems to tolerate failure. They value stability over speed, positive cash flow over record-breaking volume, and resilience over pure optimization. They grow carefully, thoughtfully, and sometimes they make the radical decision to stop growing entirely. In the end, the paradox of the big farm isn't that they're inefficient. They are incredibly efficient. The problem is that size is too often mistaken for strategy, and growth is mistaken for security. Scaling up can solve short-term financial pressure, but it often creates long-term fragility. Ultimately, successful farming isn't about how much land you control. It's about how much pressure your system can absorb. And sometimes, the strongest farms are not the biggest ones, but the ones that were intentionally designed to endure. Thanks for watching.